Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the lore they never wanted you to know.
I was a navigator's assistant when I first learned what lies between the stars, though learned is perhaps too gentle a word for the process of having reality stripped away and replaced with understanding so terrible that most who glimpse it do not survive with their sanity intact. My appointment to the position came through the standard channels of the administratum, a promotion from my previous work as a data scribe in the ship's archives, processing manifests and cargo inventories for a merchant vessel that plied the trade routes between Forge Worlds and Hive cities, carrying manufactured goods and raw materials in vast holds that extended for kilometers through the ship's belly. I had worked in those archives for 7 standard years, sitting at a cogitator terminal in a chamber lit by flickering luminators that cast everything in shades of amber and shadow, breathing recycled air that tasted of oil and old parchment, my fingers stained with ink from the physical documents that still required manual processing, despite the presence of advanced technology. The work was tedious, but secure, a position that guaranteed food and quarters, and a life expectancy measured in decades, rather than the years or months that characterized more dangerous occupations aboard the vessel. When the summons came to report to the navigator's chambers high in the ship's superstructure, I felt a mixture of pride at being selected and apprehension at leaving the familiar confines of the archives, not understanding that what awaited me was not opportunity but damnation. The navigator's chambers were located in a section of the ship I had never accessed, reached by ascending through passages that grew progressively narrower and more ornate as we climbed, the bare metal walls of the lower decks giving way to stone and carved wood, surfaces decorated with aquilus and other imperial symbols, illuminated by actual flame rather than electric light, the air growing colder and thinner until my breath came in visible puffs and my lungs ached with each inhalation. My escort was a servitor whose human components had been reduced to a torso and head mounted on a chassis of brass and steel, its face expressionless and drooling slightly, its voice when it spoke, emerging from a vox grill embedded in its throat, distorted and metallic, but still carrying the rhythms of human speech. It told me nothing about my new duties, responded to my questions with silence or incomprehensible bursts of static, simply led me through the passages until we reached a door of dark wood, reinforced with bands of metal inscribed with words in High Gothic that I could not read, and it knocked 3 times with a mechanical appendage that produced sounds like bones striking stone, then departed without waiting for acknowledgement or farewell, its treads squealing as it descended back into the depths of the ship. The door opened from within, revealing a chamber that was unlike anything I had seen aboard the vessel, a space that seemed larger than the ship's dimensions should have allowed, its ceiling lost in shadow despite the dozens of candles that burned on stands and shelves throughout the room, their flames perfectly still despite the air that moved through the space like breath. The walls were lined with books and scrolls, thousands of them, their spines bearing titles in languages I recognized, and many I did not, and between the shelves hung charts and diagrams that depicted the routes between stars, lines, and symbols that meant nothing to my untrained eye, but which I would come to understand represented the pathways through the Imperium, the warp, the sea of souls that existed beneath and beyond the material universe. In the center of the chamber sat the navigator, though I could not see her face because she wore a hood of black fabric that covered her head completely, and her body was wrapped in robes of deep purple, embroidered with silver thread that formed patterns I found difficult to focus on, designs that seemed to shift and move when I was not looking directly at them. She gestured for me to approach, her hand emerging from the robes pale and thin, fingers too long and joints that bent at angles that suggested her bones were not arranged in standard human configuration, and when she spoke her voice was soft, but carried the weight of absolute authority, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. She told me that I had been selected for the honor of serving as her assistant, that my duties would involve maintaining the chamber and its contents, recording her observations during warp translation, attending to her physical needs during the periods of exhaustion that followed extended navigation, and most importantly, maintaining absolute secrecy about anything I witnessed or learned while in her service. She told me that the knowledge navigators possessed was dangerous, that the uninitiated who learned too much about the true nature of warp travel often suffered catastrophic psychological breaks, that madness was the least terrible fate that could befall someone who stared too long into the abyss between reality and unreality. She asked if I understood the risks I was accepting, if I was prepared to serve faithfully, even if that service cost me my innocence or my sanity or my soul, and I said yes, because refusing a navigator's request was unthinkable, because I had been raised to believe that service to the Imperium in any capacity was the highest calling a human could answer, because I did not truly understand what I was agreeing to, and would not understand until it was far too late to withdraw my acceptance. She seemed to sense my ignorance, and perhaps found it amusing, or perhaps pitied me. It was impossible to tell, given that her face remained hidden beneath the hood. But she gestured to a chair positioned near her own, and told me to sit and observe, that we would be entering the warp within the hour, and she would show me what existed beyond the veil of reality, would grant me a glimpse of the truth that the Imperium kept hidden from the masses, because that truth would destroy civilization if it became widely known. The preparation for warp entry began with prayers, long litanies recited by the navigator in a language that predated the Imperium, words that had been passed down through navigator houses for millennia, and which were said to provide protection against the entities that dwelled in the Imperium. She lit additional candles arranged in specific patterns around the chamber, their flames casting shadows that moved in ways that defied the light source, and she opened containers that released smoke that smelled of spices and burning hair, incense that was supposed to purify the space and make it less permeable to warp influence. She instructed me to remain seated no matter what I saw or heard, to speak to nothing that might speak to me, to close my eyes if I felt my mind beginning to fracture under the weight of impossible visions, and she told me that some assistants did not survive their first translation, that their minds simply broke when confronted with the reality of what existed in the space between stars, but she believed I had been chosen because something in my psychological profile suggested I might possess the resilience necessary to endure what was coming. I felt fear then, cold and sharp, settling in my stomach like a stone, but I remained in the chair because leaving would have been cowardice, and cowardice aboard an imperial vessel was punishable by summary execution. Because I had nowhere to flee even if I had been willing to run, because some part of me wanted to know what she was about to show me, even though a wiser part understood that this knowledge would change me in ways I could not predict or control. The ship's Geller field activated with a sensation that traveled through the deck plates and into my bones, a vibration that was not sound but was perception, awareness of reality being bent and shaped into a protective bubble around the vessel, a barrier between the material universe and the immaterium that would theoretically protect us from the things that swam through that other space. The navigator removed her hood, and I saw her face for the first time, saw the third eye in the center of her forehead, the warp eye that allowed her to perceive the currents and eddies of the immaterium and navigate through them, an organ that was genetic mutation and blessing and curse simultaneously, marking her as different from baseline humanity, elevating her to a position of necessity and power while also condemning her to a life of isolation and service. She told me not to look directly at her warp eye, that doing so could cause permanent damage to my mind even when we were still in real space, and I fixed my gaze on the wall behind her as the ship's massive engines built to the threshold of translation, the sound building until it was less sound than it was pressure, reality straining against itself as we prepared to tear through the barrier between universes and enter the warp. The transition was not instantaneous, was rather a process that felt like being turned inside out. Like every atom of my body was being separated from every other atom and then reassembled in a different configuration, and the pain was unlike anything I had experienced, sharp and absolute, lasting for a subjective eternity that was actually only a few seconds. When it ended and my vision cleared, I saw that the navigator's warp eye was open, its iris a swirl of colors that had no names in human language, and she was staring at something I could not see, navigating currents that existed in dimensions my normal senses could not access. But the chamber had changed, or rather my perception of the chamber had changed, because now I could see through the walls, could see the warp beyond the Geller field, and what I saw broke something fundamental in my understanding of existence and reality and the nature of the universe we inhabited. The warp was not empty space or even chaotic energy. It was alive, teeming with presence and intention, entities that ranged from small predatory things like psychic parasites to vast intelligences that existed on scales I could not comprehend. Things that noticed our ship passing through their realm and took interest in us, pressing against the Geller field with curiosity or hunger or emotions that had no human equivalent. I saw souls, millions of them, perhaps billions, drifting through the warp like plankton through an ocean. The psychic residue of every thinking being that had died anywhere in the galaxy, their consciousness persisting in the Imperium in states that ranged from confusion to agony to something that might have been peace but looked more like the absence of awareness, dissolution of identity, into the background radiation of thought and emotion that composed the warp's substance. I saw things feeding on these souls, predators that consumed the psychic energy and grew stronger, that fought among themselves for territory and dominance, that occasionally noticed the Geller field protecting our ship and probed it looking for weaknesses, testing whether they could break through and access the thousands of souls contained within the vessel's hull. I saw patterns in the warp, structures that might have been natural formations or might have been constructs built by intelligence beyond human comprehension, palaces and fortresses and cities that existed in non-Euclidean geometries that sprawled across dimensions in ways that made my eyes hurt to perceive. And I understood that these were the domains of greater powers, entities that had been worshipped as gods by various species throughout galactic history, things that were not gods but were so far beyond human understanding that the distinction became meaningless. The navigator spoke without turning her attention from the warp currents she was reading, told me that what I was seeing was real but also metaphor, that the warp reflected the consciousness observing it, that different species and different individuals saw it differently based on their neurological structures and cultural frameworks, that there was no objective reality in the Imperium, only subjective experience shaped by expectation and perception. She told me that humanity's presence in the warp was particularly strong because humans were psychically active as a species. Our emotions and thoughts bleeding into the Imperium constantly, shaping it and being shaped by it in feedback loops that had been intensifying for millennia. She told me that the Emperor had understood this, had tried to create a secular imperial culture that denied the existence of gods and daemons precisely because believing in such things gave them power in the warp, made them more real and more dangerous, but that his plan had failed when the Imperium fractured during the civil war that followed his internment on the Golden Throne, when desperation and fear had driven humanity back to religious faith, and that faith had fed the warp entities that thrived on worship and attention. She told me that every prayer recited by faithful imperial citizens strengthened the things in the warp, that the ecclesiarchy's vast cathedrals and endless liturgies were building power structures in the immaterium that might one day rival or exceed the influence of the older powers, that humanity was inadvertently creating the very demons it feared through the intensity of its belief and devotion. The translation lasted 6 hours in ship time, though the navigator told me later that subjective duration in the warp was meaningless, that we might have experienced days or seconds depending on our position relative to the warp currents and the entities whose domains we passed through. During those hours I watched reality bend and twist beyond the Geller field, watched things that defied description attempt to reach our vessel, their appendages or tendrils or whatever terminology one might apply to structures that existed in more than 3 dimensions, pressing against the field with force that made the ship shudder and groan, metal screaming under stress that should have torn the hull apart, but which the field distributed and dissipated through mechanisms I did not understand. I heard sounds that were not sounds, communications from entities trying to reach through into our protected space, offers and threats and promises delivered in languages that bypassed my ears and manifested directly in my mind, voices promising power or pleasure or knowledge or transformation, if only we would lower the field and allow them entrance. The navigator ignored these communications, had presumably heard them thousands of times across her decades of service, but to me they were revelation and horror combined, proof that the universe was far stranger and more dangerous than the Imperium's propaganda suggested, that the space between stars was not empty void, but was populated by intelligences that viewed humanity as prey or toys or resources to be harvested and consumed. We emerged from the warp into real space with the same violent transition that had marked our entry, the ship shuddering as reality reasserted itself around us, the Geller field collapsing as it was no longer needed, and the chamber returned to its normal appearance. the walls becoming solid stone and wood again, the impossible vistas of the warp vanishing as though they had never existed. The navigator closed her warp eye and replaced her hood, and I saw that she was trembling slightly, exhausted by the effort of navigation, her pale hands shaking as she reached for a glass of water on the table beside her chair. She told me that the translation had been routine, that we had not encountered any significant threats or unusual warp phenomena, that this was what every warp journey was like for those capable of perceiving the Imperium's true nature. She told me that I had done well to remain conscious and coherent, that many assistants lost control during their first exposure and had to be restrained or sedated or in extreme cases executed before their madness could spread to other crew members. She told me to return to my quarters and rest, that we would remain in real space for several days while the ship conducted its business at the destination system, and that I should use that time to process what I had witnessed and prepare myself for the return journey through the warp, which would be necessary once our cargo and passenger exchanges were completed. I walked back through the ship's corridors in a daze, my mind struggling to integrate what I had seen with my previous understanding of reality, and I found that I could not look at the other crew members without seeing them as souls, as bright points of psychic energy that existed simultaneously in real space and in the warp, their thoughts and emotions bleeding through into that other dimension constantly, even though they were unaware of the process. I saw servitors differently now, understood that their lobotomized brains made them almost invisible in the warp, that this was one reason the Imperium used them so extensively on ships that traveled through the Imperium, because they produced minimal psychic signature and thus attracted less attention from the entities that hunted human consciousness. I saw the ship itself differently, understood that it was not just a physical vessel but was also a psychic construct, the collective belief and faith of its crew shaping a presence in the warp that provided additional protection beyond what the Geller field offered, the ship's machine spirit being not superstition but reality, an emergent consciousness that existed in the overlap between material and immaterial universes. Everything I had been taught about the nature of reality had been revealed as incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst, the Imperium's official doctrine presenting a simplified version of existence that hid the terrible truth about what lay beyond the boundaries of normal perception. The nightmares began that night, dreams that were not entirely dreams but were memories of what I had seen during the translation, visions of the warp and its inhabitants that haunted my sleep and followed me into waking consciousness, entities that had noticed me during our passage and maintained interest in me, pressing against my mind from their realm, trying to establish communication or influence, or simply feeding on the fear they generated through their attention. I tried to dismiss these experiences as psychological aftermath of trauma, natural response to witnessing things the human mind was not evolved to process, but the navigator told me when I reported to her chambers the next day that this was not entirely accurate, that I had been marked by the warp during our translation, that entities there had recognized me as someone capable of perceiving them and thus had classified me as either potential servant or prey, that I would likely carry this mark for the remainder of my life and would need to develop defenses against the constant low-level assault on my consciousness that would characterize my existence from this point forward. She taught me prayers that were not really prayers but were mental exercises, techniques for constructing barriers in my mind that would make me less accessible to warp entities, less visible to their senses, less interesting as a target for corruption or possession. She told me that these techniques would only provide partial protection, that perfect shielding was impossible for anyone who had to regularly expose themselves to the warp, that even navigators with centuries of training and genetic advantages specific to warp resistance were slowly corrupted by extended exposure, their minds and souls gradually warped by contact with the Imperium until they became something other than human, something that existed in the space between material and immaterial reality. I served the navigator for 3 standard years, assisting with dozens of warp translations, each one revealing new horrors and deepening my understanding of the terrible truth that underlay the Imperium's existence. I learned that the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided ships through the warp, was powered by the souls of psychers. Thousands of them fed daily into the mechanism that maintained the beacon, their life force burned away in instants to produce the light that made interstellar navigation possible. I learned that the Emperor himself was consuming these souls, that his failing body on the golden throne required constant influx of psychic energy to maintain whatever consciousness remained after 10,000 years of entombment, that the Imperium was sustained by systematic sacrifice of its psychically gifted children, thousands dying every day to feed the corpse god who supposedly protected humanity from the threats that lurked in the warp. I learned that this protection was both real and inadequate, that the Emperor's presence in the warp had kept the worst entities at bay, but had also attracted their attention and focused their malice on humanity, that we existed in a state of siege with enemies pressing against our defenses constantly, enemies that were patient and immortal, and could afford to wait centuries or millennia for opportunities to break through and corrupt or consume the species that had dared to claim sovereignty over the material galaxy. I learned that some ships never emerged from the warp, that translation was always a risk, even with navigator guidance and Geller field protection, that sometimes the field failed, or the ship strayed too close to dangerous warp phenomena, or entities simply overwhelmed the defenses through persistence or power beyond our capacity to resist. I learned that ships that vanished were sometimes found years or centuries later, drifting through the void as tomb ships, their crews dead or transformed into things that had to be destroyed on sight, their hulls corrupted by warp exposure into forms that resembled organic growth more than manufactured metal. I learned that some ships emerged from the warp in the wrong time, arriving decades or centuries before or after their intended translation, causality breaking down in the Imperium where past and present and future existed simultaneously, and the laws of physics that governed real space held no authority. I learned that crew members sometimes disappeared during warp travel, even aboard properly shielded vessels, plucked from corridors or quarters by entities that found ways through the Geller field, taken to destinations in the warp, where they would suffer fates worse than death, their souls preserved and tormented for eternities that had no meaning in a realm where time was not linear. The turning point came during a translation that should have been routine, a short jump between systems that was estimated to require only 4 hours of warp exposure. We entered the Imperium as always, the navigator opening her warp eye to perceive the currents, but something was different this time. Something was wrong in ways I could feel but could not articulate. The warp outside the Geller field was more turbulent than usual, the entities more aggressive, pressing against our protection with force that made the ship groan and lights flicker throughout the vessel. The navigator's expression behind her hood was tense, her pale hands gripping the arms of her chair with enough force that I could see the bones through her skin, and she muttered continuously under her breath, reciting protective litanies or navigation calculations, or perhaps simply talking to herself to maintain focus against the psychic pressure bearing down on us. I felt something watching us, not the small, predatory entities that always took interest in passing ships, but something vast, an intelligence that dwarfed everything else in the warp, a presence that filled my perception with weight and terrible attention, and I understood that we had strayed too close to one of the great powers, one of the entities that ruled domains in the Imperium and commanded legions of lesser demons in wars that had been raging since before humanity left Earth. The entity spoke to me, not in words but in concepts that manifested directly in my consciousness, offering me knowledge and power and liberation from the prison of flesh and material existence, showing me visions of what I could become if I accepted its patronage, the secrets I could learn, the perspectives I could access, and all it asked in exchange was permission to enter, for me to voluntarily lower the mental barriers I had constructed under the navigator's guidance and allow it to establish a connection between my soul and its realm. I felt the temptation, felt how reasonable the offer seemed, how limited and constrained my existence was compared to what was being offered, how small and fearful humanity's Imperium appeared when viewed from the perspective of something that had existed for millions of years and would continue existing long after every human had died and been forgotten. But I also felt the navigator's attention snap toward me, felt her psychic power slam into me like physical impact, severing the connection between my mind and the entity, pushing it back beyond the range where it could directly influence my thoughts, and she screamed at me to reinforce my barriers and recite the protective litanies, and above all not to listen to anything the things in the warp promised, because all of it was lies, seduction leading to damnation, corruption that would destroy not just my physical form but my soul. condemning me to eternal torment or dissolution or service to powers that were absolutely antithetical to human existence. The translation ended badly, our emergence from the warp explosive and violent, alarms screaming throughout the ship as systems failed or overloaded, sections of the hull buckled from stresses that should have been impossible within a functioning Geller field, crew members reporting casualties and damage on every deck. The navigator collapsed in her chair, blood running from her nose and ears, her warp eye still open and staring at nothing, seeing things I could not perceive, and when I approached to help her, she grabbed my arm with strength that should not have been possible for someone so frail, pulled me close, and whispered that the field had been breached for approximately 3 seconds during the translation, that we had been exposed to the raw warp without protection, that something had likely gotten aboard the ship during that breach, that I needed to report to the ship's security immediately and tell them to begin searching for signs of possession or corruption before whatever had entered could establish itself and begin spreading its influence among the crew. She told me that I had done well to resist the entity's temptation, but that the experience had marked me more deeply than before, that I was now visible to every demon and warp predator as someone who had been touched by one of the great powers, that I could never fully escape that taint, that it would follow me for the remainder of my existence, regardless of how far I ran or what defenses I erected. The ship's security found the possessed crew member 3 days later, a junior tech priest who had been working in the engine compartments when the field breach occurred, whose body had been taken over by something that used him as a meat puppet to move through the ship, spreading corruption, infecting other crew members with whispered heresies and subtle mutations that would have eventually transformed the entire vessel into a demon ship if the infestation had not been caught early. They burned him alive in the ship's incinerator, along with 17 other crew members who had been compromised by contact with him, their screams echoing through the Vox systems until someone had the sense to cut the audio, and they sealed the sections of the ship where he had been with blessed locks and posted guards with orders to shoot anyone who tried to enter without authorization. The navigator survived, but was permanently damaged by the experience, her warp eye no longer closing properly, even when we were in real space. Her mind clearly fractured by whatever she had perceived during the breach, her speech becoming increasingly disconnected from reality, mixing prophecy and madness, and fragments of languages that predated human civilization. The ship's command decided to return to port for repairs, and to transfer the navigator to whatever facilities her house maintained for members who had been injured in service, and I was questioned extensively about what had happened during the translation, about whether I had been corrupted, about what the entity had offered me and why I had refused. They determined I was still loyal and sane, at least according to the crude psychological evaluations available to a merchant vessel's limited medical staff, but they decided I was too much of a risk to retain as navigator's assistant, given my multiple exposures to warp phenomena, and they reassigned me to data scribe duties in a different section of the ship, farther from the navigator's chambers, with instructions to report immediately if I experienced any visions or heard any voices or noticed any signs of developing psychic abilities. I spent the next 2 years trying to return to the mundane existence I had known before my promotion, sitting at cogitator terminals and processing manifests, but I could not unsee what I had seen, could not unknow what I had learned about the true nature of reality and the Imperium's place in the cosmos. The nightmares never stopped, the pressure against my mind never fully ceased. I could feel the warp always present, beyond the thin barrier of reality. Could sense the entities there maintaining their interest in me, waiting for opportunities to reach through and influence or corrupt or simply destroy me, for their entertainment or to satisfy hungers I could not comprehend. I am writing this as a warning and a confession, as testimony about what lies between the stars and what it costs humanity to maintain our presence across the galaxy. I am writing this because I know I will not survive much longer, can feel the corruption spreading through my mind, like infection through tissue, can feel my barriers weakening despite constant vigilance and prayer, can feel something waiting on the other side of consciousness, ready to step into my body the moment my defenses finally fail. I am writing this so that someone might understand what warp travel truly means, what we are exposing ourselves to every time a ship translates from real space to Imperium and back, what kinds of things are paying attention to humanity and waiting for opportunities to breach our defenses and consume or corrupt our species. The Imperium presents warp travel as merely dangerous, as a necessary risk that can be managed through proper technology and training and faith. But this is a lie told to maintain morale and prevent the psychological collapse that would follow if the general population understood the true nature of the threat. The warp is not merely dangerous, it is inimical to human existence at a fundamental level, populated by entities that view us as prey or tools or amusing diversions, that have intelligence and will and patience beyond anything evolution could produce, that can think in dimensions and timescales that make human consciousness appear as brief and insignificant as the flickering of a candle flame. Every journey through the warp exposes thousands of souls to these entities, creates opportunities for corruption or possession, or simply exposure to truths that the human mind was never meant to comprehend, and the cumulative effect across millions of journeys and billions of travelers is that humanity is being slowly infected by the warp, slowly transformed into something that exists partially in that realm, even while maintaining physical form in real space, becoming more psychically active, and thus more visible to the predators that hunt the Imperium, creating feedback loops that will eventually either elevate us to a new form of existence, or destroy us completely in apocalyptic scenarios that I have glimpsed in my nightmares. The Emperor understood this, built the Imperium as a dam against the warp's influence, tried to create secular, rational human civilization that would have minimal presence in the Imperium and thus minimal vulnerability to its dangers, but his plan failed when religious faith became necessary to maintain cohesion across the galactic empire he had built, when desperation and fear drove humanity back to worshipping him as a god, when that worship created power structures in the warp that now shape and constrain human destiny in ways the Emperor never intended and can no longer control from his position on the Golden Throne. The truth is that we are trapped, that interstellar civilization requires warp travel, that warp travel exposes us to corruption, that corruption spreads through the population, making us more psychically active and thus more dependent on psychically powerful individuals to navigate and protect us, that these individuals are themselves most vulnerable to corruption due to their exposure, that the entire system is slowly consuming itself in ways that will eventually either result in humanity ascending to some new form of existence or being completely destroyed by forces we awakened through our use of the Imperium for transportation and communication. There is no escape, no solution, no path forward that does not lead through horrors beyond description, and the only choice available to us is whether we face this truth with open eyes or continue to hide behind comforting lies that make our doom slightly more palatable but no less certain. I choose truth, choose to testify about what I have seen and learned, even though I know this testimony will mark me as heretic or madman. Even though I understand that anyone who reads this will likely destroy it and condemn me for writing it, because I believe that understanding is better than ignorance, even when that understanding brings only despair, because I believe that humans deserve to know what their civilization is built upon and what price we are paying for our empire among the stars. The corruption has progressed too far now. I can feel it consuming the last vestiges of my humanity, can feel something else emerging from beneath my consciousness, like a creature breaking through thin ice. And I know I have very little time remaining before I am no longer the person writing these words, before I become a puppet for whatever entity has been waiting in my mind since the breach, before I transform into one of the corrupted things I have learned to fear and recognize during my time in the Navigator's service. I am scheduling this testimony to transmit automatically to multiple destinations after I am gone, hoping that at least one copy will reach someone capable of understanding its importance, someone who might be able to use this knowledge to prepare or to warn or simply to understand what we are facing as a species. I am sorry for what I am about to become, sorry for whatever harm I may cause once the transformation is complete, but I am not sorry for learning the truth or for attempting to share it, because truth is all we have that the warp cannot corrupt, the one thing the entities there fear, because it exposes their nature and limits their power over those who understand what they truly are. The warp is real, the daemons are real, the corruption is real, and every journey between stars exposes us to dangers that could destroy our species, but we continue traveling because the alternative is isolation and decline and eventual extinction, because humanity has chosen to gamble its soul for the possibility of greatness, and that gamble may be one we ultimately lose, but it is the only game being played in this terrible universe we inhabit. The Emperor protects, they tell us, but I have seen what his protection looks like, have seen the price paid by those who maintain it, and I understand now that we are not being protected, but merely preserved, kept alive long enough to serve purposes we do not understand in wars that were ancient before humanity left Earth, and that understanding is the darkest truth of all.